As Venezuela faces one of the most consequential moments in its modern history, uncertainty dominates the political and legal landscape. After Washington announced the arrest of President Nicolas Maduro, U.S. President Donald Trump said the United States is going to run the country until what he called a safe, proper, and judicious transition, while stressing that no American troops would be deployed. Caracas has rejected the move, saying it violates sovereignty and international law, and Venezuela's defense minister has warned against any form of foreign control. International reactions have been swift, with European calls for restraint and renewed emphasis from China and Russia on the principle of non-interference. Inside the United States, Trump's remarks have also revived debate over America first and Washington's long-term legal and political obligations. Who governs Venezuela now, and under what legal authority? How will the international community react, and what implications does this have for the region and the world? And I'm Salma El-Feki, and welcome to In Depth. Axios reports that Trump's decision to run Venezuela after the capture of President Nicolas Maduro marks a clear exception to his long-standing isolationist rhetoric. Trump has built his foreign policy brand on rejecting intervention and nation-building, repeatedly pledging that the United States would stop toppling regimes and rebuilding countries. Yet Venezuela has consistently stood apart in his thinking. At a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, Trump said the U.S. would govern Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition, while outlining plans for U.S. oil companies to invest heavily in the country's infrastructure. He framed the approach as the Donroe Doctrine, a play on the Monroe Doctrine, asserting renewed American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Axios notes that the policy mirrors post-invasion models Trump once criticized, including the U.S. oversight and protection of economic interests. While Trump has opposed intervention elsewhere, he has long cited Venezuela's proximity and vast oil reserves as a justification for special treatment. He has not clarified how long the U.S. involvement will last or what defines the transition's end. And The Guardian reports that leading international law experts widely question the legality of the U.S. attack on Venezuela and the capture of Maduro. While Washington is expected to justify its actions by claiming self-defense, legal scholars say the operation likely violates the UN Charter, particularly Article 2, Paragraph 4, which prohibits the use of force against another state and requires respect for sovereignty. Experts cited by The Guardian argue there is no evidence Venezuela posed an imminent military threat to the United States, and some scholars said the operation could only be lawful with UN Security Council authorization or a clear case of self-defense, neither of which appears to exist. Claims that Maduro led a narco-terrorist organization, they argue, do not meet the legal threshold for the intervention. The Guardian notes that meaningful sanctions against the U.S. are unlikely due to a Security Council veto, and experts warn the lack of consequences could weaken international law and set a dangerous global precedent.
Explosions shocked parts of Caracas as Washington announced the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Soon after, U.S. President Donald Trump addressed the move in a press conference. Trump said the United States is going to run the country until what he called a safe, proper, and judicious transition. He stressed there would be no American troops deployed to Venezuela. The White House described the operation as successful. Trump praised its execution and said it showed American strength. He also spoke about Venezuela's oil sector. Trump said U.S. oil companies could help repair what he called badly broken infrastructure and sell oil internationally. Caracas rejected Washington's move. Venezuela says the arrest violates sovereignty and international law. The defense minister Maduro remains the country's president after being asked about the state of governance. International reactions followed quickly. France and Italy called for restraint and respect for international law. They urged dialogue and warned against escalation. China and Russia reaffirmed their support for the principle of non-interference. They said Venezuela's future must be decided by Venezuelans. In Washington, questions are emerging. Trump campaigned on America First and avoiding foreign interventions. Lawmakers and analysts are now debating the legal and political obligations implied by governing another country. Cuba is watching developments closely. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Cuban leaders should be concerned after the U.S. military operation in Venezuela. The path forward remains unclear, as the scope of American control over the country is not yet known. For now, Venezuela stands at the center of a global test of power, law, and sovereignty.
And for more analysis, we are joined from Florida by Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, the Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center. Welcome, sir. And thank you so much for joining us here today. Mr. Russell, let me ask you, President Trump says the U.S. is going to run Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition. How does the U.S. policy define that transition under international law, sir?
Well, good afternoon, Talent, and always good to be with you. Thanks for having me. That's a question I even think that the White House has. There is no policy, basically. This was a well-executed, well-performed operation that was done in the beginning as a law enforcement operation to apprehend a fugitive from U.S. justice. And that is why we saw specialized federal agents working with the Special Operations Forces from the Department of Defense in the apprehension of President Maduro and his wife. What it turned into after the press conference was a made-up policy, this Don Road doctrine, as he called it, of the complete 180 of what he campaigned on. This was not a law enforcement. This was a power grab. This was a moment of greed, ego, and self-importance, and that is not a solid foreign policy to have, particularly when you are a superpower. This is not a rogue nation. This is a rogue superpower gone off the rails, and it poses a direct threat to many governments, legitimately elected governments in the Western Hemisphere, if not the world.
Obviously, yeah. Well, Mr. Russell, Axios describes Trump's Venezuela policy as a clear exception to his anti-nation building and anti-intervention doctrine. Is this a contradiction, do you think, or evidence that the America First was always selectively applied?
Absolutely, this is a contradiction. Look, he was asked yesterday during the press conference at Mar-a-Lago, how does, the U.S., quote unquote, taking over Venezuela, America First? And he went into a long diatribe that didn't make any sense and didn't answer the question. The bottom line is he can't answer the question. This is a very, very serious issue that I'm a little shocked that some of his advisors have not kind of tried to rein this policy in from him. This is about oil, it's about money,
yes,
and it's about greed.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line.
Okay, we are now joined from Cairo by Mr. Mohammed Osman, the International Relations Specialist. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining us here today at In Depth.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Thank you. Mr. Osman, let me ask you, Trump stated the U.S. will govern Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition. How does Caracas, do you think, interpret that statement in terms of sovereignty, international law, and so many other things?
It seems that, to my knowledge, and given the variables on the ground, that Mr. Trump's statements do not necessarily reflect realities on the ground, because Mr. Trump indicated that what remains of the Maduro regime or the Maduro government in Venezuela will be cooperative, will submit basically and give in to U.S. leadership and U.S. demands and U.S. designs for the future of Venezuela and arrangements as well for the U.S. exploitation of the oil resources of the country. It seems from what we have read from between the lines and within the lines of what Mr. Trump has said. He was very explicit yesterday. However, what we have heard from the leadership in Venezuela is a very, 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 very different set of signaling. What the vice president, or now the acting president, Rodriguez, she was sworn in today by the Supreme Court of Venezuela. She was very defiant in her statements. She said that we will not become a new colony, that President Maduro still is the legitimate president of Venezuela. They demanded his return, and they basically said they dismissed what the United States has said. When Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was asked how he would like to respond to that, he said that he will have to wait for a few days to calibrate the actual position or the actual stance of the Venezuelan government. Yeah. So far, there seems to be a very, very sizable amount of uncertainty and dubiousness even surrounding the leadership situation in Venezuela.
Yeah. Mr. Osman, Trump says that the U.S. forces would avoid boots on the ground, but still govern, implying a longer-term role for the U.S. in governance and oil. How is that received inside Venezuela, if you can share with us, and how is the absence of troops viewed?
Well, first of all, it's understandable that the United States would actually elect not to have any permanent military presence on the ground in Venezuela in a conflict situation, because this will turn into a protracted conflict, and U.S. troops will be seen as an occupation force, and they are an occupation force if they are to occupy the country against the will of the legitimate government and the people. As for the public in Venezuela, it's quite divided. Some people welcomed the departure of Maduro and welcomed the U.S. moves. I don't think they are a majority, but they are a sizable portion of the population. Others very supportive of Maduro and the Socialist Party are very angry and vocal about a violation of their government, their state's sovereignty, and the illegal abduction. And it is an illegal abduction according to international law of President Maduro. And on the other hand, you have Venezuelans who are not big fans of Maduro and would like to see him gone, but they're definitely not okay with the idea of a foreign power making the political changes in their country or engaging in any form of regime change. So it's basically received with a very mixed reaction from the Venezuelan population. And definitely, if there are to be U.S. troops on the ground, they will be vulnerable to and susceptible to attacks from elements on the ground in Venezuela. And probably if they try to invade the country in full force, the Venezuelan military and paramilitary forces will resist the invasion, definitely.
Mr. Russell, I'm back to you again. Trump says the U.S. oil companies would fix the badly broken infrastructure, according to Trump, and sell the Venezuelan oil. What is the legal and ethical concerns that arise from this framing, and how do you think the issue of oil played a role in Trump's decision to run Venezuela after arresting Maduro?
Well, I mean, let me start with the first part of that question, Selma, is the fact that Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the West. It has the biggest one in the Western Hemisphere, and one of them in the world. And PDVSA, the National Petroleum Company of Venezuela, has largely been pre-Chavez, pre-Maduro, a large-scale oil producer and a large-scale petrochemical player in the industry. That being the case, after Chavez and Maduro came into power, it was largely kind of looked at as a bank account for Venezuela and the Venezuelan elite in the inner circle of Chavez and Maduro. That being the case, this is a huge ethical and legal question. Is you're talking about as the national oil company of Venezuela, which is now federalized under the Chavez and Maduro combination, is a national asset. Are we going to seize that as a war trophy? There's so many questions on this, and we've never gone through this in modern times. What we have to look at also is the fact is how much is the Venezuelan people willing to give up for this? You've got a leadership vacuum right now in Caracas, and that poses an even bigger problem going down the road, from day 2 to day 90, is this power vacuum of who is in power, who runs the infrastructure, who runs PDVSA, and what are they doing about it? Look, the infrastructure there is absolutely shot. They've not invested in it. It does not have the production capability that they had, say, 35 years ago, but it still does produce. Mm-hmm. So if oil companies are going to come in there and they're going to all of a sudden start throwing billions and billions of dollars, who are the oil companies? It's not just a big industry-wide. They're going to want to have a competitive advantage. If you think that, and by the way, just so everybody knows, PDVSA owns a large U.S. petroleum company already. PDVSA owns the retailer and production company known as Citgo. And so who handles that? There's a conflict of interest issue there. There are so many questions that have yet to be answered, that need to be answered before we start putting the ball in motion.
Yeah. Mr. Osman, The Guardian cites multiple legal experts saying that the operation taking place likely violates Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. On what legal basis can Washington dispute that assessment?
The short answer is none. They have absolutely no international legal basis to base their move on. But I don't think that President Trump himself or the Trump administration, for that matter, really care about the international legality of what they have committed, basically. This is basically an act of war, an illegal act of war, act of aggression, rather, and it targeted a president who was illegally apprehended. He was the legitimate president of Venezuela, whether the United States recognized him or not. I reckon that the United States and many European countries do not recognize Maduro since 2018 as a legitimate president. However, he was universally accepted by everyone else, which is the majority of the world and the United Nations, as the official legitimate legal president of the country. So basically his illegal apprehension, despite the legal immunity provided to him as a head of state by the Vienna Convention, is rather laughable. But at the end of the day, we are in an age and an era, Salma, that where international law is completely disregarded. We have seen that over 2 years of genocide in Gaza. Yes, we're seeing that, of course, in the war in Ukraine. We're seeing that in how every great power in the world is conducting itself at this moment way beyond the law. So the United States is keeping up with that trend, even though they actually created that trend a few decades ago, unfortunately. So now they are acting with impunity. They did that because they can do this. They feel no legal ramifications. The United Nations, of course, will be incapable of making any moves. The UN Security Council will certainly block any move against the United States because the United States is a veto power. This is not going to even be entertained. And also, the other great powers, it seems, Salma, the veto powers, especially even Russia and China, who are allies of Venezuela, it seems that they are not as vocal as they should be about the removal of Maduro. Yes, they condemned what happened, but they abandoned a person who saw himself as their ally, at least, and as their partner. And at the same time, they're not really willing to take any steps to challenge the United States in its traditional sphere of influence. President Trump basically has resuscitated the Monroe Doctrine once again, assuming that it was dead, and it was never dead, by the way. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a testament to that. So he resuscitated it in a new form in the 21st century and is applying it, and other great powers seem to be okay with it.
Actually, my next question to Mr. Russell will also be about the Monroe Doctrine, which he calls his approach the Monroe Doctrine, invoking the Monroe Doctrine. How does reviving hemispheric dominance, sir, this kind of language mean at this point?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, we shouldn't be necessarily overly surprised about this maneuver. Look, Donald Trump, from the day he walked into office, has been talking about making Canada the 51st state. He's been talking about using military action to grab Greenland. He just the other day, not within hours of the apprehension of Maduro, literally was saying that Colombia, Cuba, and even now Sheinbaum in Mexico needs to watch their actions. I mean, everybody in the Western Hemisphere is saying, wait a minute, did you just threaten your two big neighbors with possible military action for not agreeing with you? Well, guess what? That's going to isolate the U.S. even more. This is not going to make America great again. This is going to make America isolated in its own backyard, which is never good for and here's the trick, Selma, is the economic impact of that decision could be catastrophic for Donald Trump's administration, for the U.S. economy, and for the Republican Party. And that's what nobody realizes right now. This is a tripwire moment for the Trump administration, because if they screw this up, this is going to have long-term effects, not only on U.S. policy and U.S. standing in the Western Hemisphere, but politically here in the United States for a long time.
Yeah. Mr. Osman, as I was mentioning to Mr. Russell earlier, Trump's mention of the U.S. oil companies fixing infrastructure in Venezuela. How is this viewed in Venezuela's oil sector and political circles, if you can tell us, please?
Before I answer your question, I just would like to comment very briefly and quickly on what Mr. Russell said. I might disagree with him a bit about the idea that the United States will be isolated in its own backyard. Of course, I am equally critical of what the U.S. did, and I completely oppose it on moral grounds, definitely. However, I don't think that this will really isolate the U.S. in their own backyard, because the Western Hemisphere cannot afford to isolate the United States. The U.S. is the greatest power over there. No one can challenge them by hundreds and hundreds of miles. The gap is. So the thing is that, and of course, I don't think President Trump is serious about pursuing military action against Colombia or Mexico, established democracies that have been historically allied to the United States, at least in the 20th and 21st centuries. But at the same time, what happened in Venezuela did not occur in a vacuum. This is a coordinated policy adopted by successive U.S. administrations since the Bush administration. The idea of isolating Venezuela, sanctioning Venezuela, attempting to squeeze them out of the international economy. President Bush, the Bush administration, attempted a coup attempt against Venezuela in the early 2000s. Yeah. There was an assassination attempt on Maduro. Back then it was against Chavez, and the people foiled it, and loyal elements of the military that were loyal to Chavez back then. And also, during Maduro, there were several assassination attempts on Maduro's life in Trump's first term. So the thing is that the idea, and President Obama even took punitive measures against the Maduro government. So the idea that getting rid of this regime in Venezuela and bringing Venezuela back to the U.S. sphere of influence, this is not a Trump invention. This is a coordinated U.S. policy. Trump just elected to use hard power in order to accomplish that. Of course, I'm not speaking from a moral perspective. I'm speaking from a geopolitical perspective and an international relations perspective. So the idea that the United States will be isolated by what happened in Venezuela, that's not true. Some governments in Latin America, even like Argentina and President Bukele of Ecuador.
In terms of, Mr. Osman, in terms of mentioning the U.S. oil companies fixing infrastructure, how is this viewed in Venezuela's oil sector and political circles? Mr. Osman.
I think that given what we have heard and what we have seen, the current Venezuelan leadership will not allow the U.S., of course, to access its oil facilities coercively. And by the way, Chevron does have investments in Venezuela still, so there are U.S. companies in Venezuela. And what I've heard is that many other U.S. companies like ExxonMobil and others are very skeptic about re-entering the Venezuelan market without a sustained political stability in the country, and they have a wait-and-see approach to see whether President Trump really can install a government in Venezuela that will actually provide a sustainable amount of political stability, so that they can invest in a country with a degraded infrastructure, as Mr. Russell correctly pointed out, and you pointed out as well. However, the existing government in Venezuela at the moment, at least until now, has not given any signals that they are willing to cooperate with the United States. This might change over the next few days, and this is what Marco Rubio hinted at when he was asked. He said this will be a wait and see approach. Maybe there are negotiations going back behind the scenes that might reveal things that are the opposite to what's going on right now.
Okay. Mr. Russell, how does this fit within Trump's America First non-intervention stance, and how is it received within his supporters and the MAGA base?
Well, that's a great question, Saba. And the reality is that this should set off the MAGA base. I mean, look, Donald Trump campaigned in 2024 of saying, I'm going to take America out of nation building business. I'm going to take America out of these long-term wars. I'm going to take America from putting boots on the ground overseas unnecessarily. Well, all three of those have been violated in the past 24 hours by Donald Trump. You know, the aftermath of this, because now you've got even Republicans on the Hill now are starting to question not so much, and there's one thing I want to point out, is that the actual reasoning for apprehending Nicolas Maduro is valid. We saw this in 1989 when the U.S., in conjunction with several of our international partners, apprehended Manuel Noriega out of Panama, a duly elected who was a fugitive from international justice, who had a red notice on him, an arrest warrant here in the United States, and we apprehended him. It was actually good for Panama. Look at Panama today. What we're seeing, though, now is the apprehension and the intent was solid. But what it does is they overstepped the boundaries the second they started talking about the U.S. taking over a government. It sounds like nation building. They're doing it in a vacuum because nobody knows who is running who is running the government there in Caracas. Heck, we don't even know where Vice President Rodriguez is, or actually now President Rodriguez is. And if that vacuum continues to grow, well, what we're going to see is instability, which will begot a whole new problem for the U.S. Because if there's a power vacuum and a civil battle going on inside Venezuela for power, then it's not stable enough for U.S. investments to come swooping in to fix PDVSA. And now we've got a failed state.
Yeah.
So this is going to make a lot of Republicans and a lot of MAGA supporters very, very angry, because Trump just did exactly the opposite.
Exactly. Mr. Russell, I was just going to ask you, what do you have to say about the contradiction with Trump? What he's doing is different than what he's saying. What we're seeing is totally different.
Absolutely. What we're seeing here is pure, unadulterated ego and greed leading foreign policy. This was an ego play.
Okay.
He wants to be the biggest player in the hemisphere, and this is how he gets to show it, even though it contradicts everything that he ran on. So again, you know, a lot of them, if you poll a lot of the MAGA supporters, they're going to sit there and say, we're tired of quagmires like Afghanistan. He eviscerated the Biden administration for the handling of Afghanistan. They have eviscerated Bush on Iraq. This is Trump's Iraq.
Okay, let me move to Mr. Osman. Venezuela has denounced the U.S. action internationally. How do Trump's remarks about transition affect Venezuela's engagement with the international community and international bodies like the UN or states like Russia and China, sir?
Well, right now, we do not really have a legitimacy crisis in Venezuela because there are no two opposing parties claiming leadership. We have a president who was illegally apprehended and abducted by the United States, and he was replaced, per the constitution of Venezuela, temporarily at least, by an interim president, which is his vice president. Of course, President Maduro is not coming to Venezuela anytime soon, or ever actually, and probably he will never come back to power. And I think that the Venezuelan leadership knows that very well. They are just trying to lead a smooth transition to a new leadership. However, the regime and the government still intact, and this regime and government is still recognized by the international community, or most of the international community, except the West. It's not even clear whether the Europeans and the Americans will maintain their position on denying this regime legitimacy after the removal of Maduro. And the United Nations, of course, they will recognize the government that has constitutionally taken over power, which is basically an extension of the Maduro government, it seems. However, all of this might change in the coming days, and I think President Trump,
we're going to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose so. That was Mr. Mohammed Osman, the International Relations Specialist, and Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, the Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me here and for your insights. And with this, that brings us to the end of today's episode for In Depth. Thank you so much for joining us, and do stay tuned for more updates on Q News.